We've been from Harlem to Ethiopia to the West Indies. We end up somewhere in Southern Africa with this panel, but also conceptually beyond Southern Africa as well. It's titled Anti-Post-Colonial Struggles, and I'm hoping that we can look at some of the continuities and disjunctures between the anti-colonial moment and the post-colonial present. So some of the issues that we're going to be touching upon include nationalism and perhaps exhausted nationalism, the implications of the post-apartheid struggle in Southern Africa for struggles within the region and for thinking about African nationalism broadly. Cabral actually, in a number of his writings, brings up the anti-apartheid movement and what's happening in Southern Africa explicitly, so there's that connection there between Cabral's own thinking and what's happening at the southern tip of the continent as well. Also, some of the presentations are going to touch on the realities, the material realities and the discourses of nationalism and development today, and how the dynamics of neocolonialism have played out in state formations, and also identity, subjectivity, and especially labor in Africa and Southern Africa today, and their relation to nationalist movements. So I hope we can bring some of the discussions that we've had, which historical investigation of African nationalism across geographies, into the sort of present today, and bring that discussion, this panel, into the discussion period too. So I think we'll begin with Saul. John's a professor emeritus in the Department of Political Science here at York. He's taught extensively in Africa at universities in Mozambique, Tanzania and South Africa. He was active in the anti-apartheid movement here in Canada for many years. The author of many books. Most recent is Revolutionary Traveller, Freeze Frames from the Life, and an upcoming book that he tells me will be out soon with Patrick Bonds, titled South Africa's Present as History, from Mrs. Press to Marikana. So I'll turn it over to John.
Thank you. I just wanted to be absolutely clear about the title. It's not anti-post-colonial struggles, it's anti-post-colonial.
Not a small distinction.
Because I'm all for post-colonial struggles. But I, as Chris has said, I have been finishing this history of South Africa. And of course, you can't study Africa generally, or the world for that matter, certainly not South Africa, without talking about race and class at the same time. And so I'm quite sensitive to this whole question of race and class and how we integrate the analysis of both. They both speak to a reality, but in complex ways that we have to sort out. And I don't think one can be left on the back burner. Well, let's talk about race, class, footnote. Let's talk about class, race, footnote. It doesn't work that way. The interplay is quite much more complicated than that. So that's partly what I'm driving at in this paper, but a variety of other things as well, and probably too many things. So stop me if I won't stop. I should also say that the quote I read earlier from Cabral, I think, is an important one to keep in mind, and with your permission, I'll just quote it again, if I may. That he was skeptical to the true nature of the national liberation struggle, wondering whether the national liberation struggle was not, in fact, an imperialist initiative. Well, that's a very gamey sentence indeed, coming from Cabral. He goes on to say, there is something wrong with the simple interpretation of the national liberation struggle as a revolutionary trend. The objective of the imperialist countries was to prevent the enlargement of the socialist countries, to liberate the reactionary forces in our country which are being stifled by colonialism, and to enable these forces to ally themselves with the international bourgeoisie. Well, that's a very punchy statement indeed from Cabral. It echoes, of course, many statements I could quote endlessly from Fanon, who says much the same thing. The national middle class, he says, of African independence elsewhere in Africa than Southern Africa, in the north where he was primarily interested. The national liberation struggle discovers its historic mission, that of intermediary. Seen through its eyes, its mission has nothing to do with transforming the nation. It consists prosaically of being the transmission lines between the nation and a capitalism, rampant though camouflage, which today puts on the mask of neocolonialism. The national bourgeoisie will be quite content with the role of the Western bourgeoisie's business agent and will play its part without any complexes in a most dignified manner. But the same lucrative role, this cheap jack's function, this meanness of outlook, and this absence of all ambition symbolize the incapability of the national middle class to fulfill its historic role as a bourgeoisie. And I've got several other quotes that capture the same statement from Fanon. It's a very strong statement, as was Cabral's, about false decolonization. What seems like liberation, but is not really liberation at all. Now, of course, on the other hand, that is in no way to write a support letter for racist colonialism. It was a racist system as well. Du Bois, who's been quoted several times, you may recall, made what I think is a rather profound and important statement at one point. He says, in 1903, he wrote the following prophecy: "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker and to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America and the islands of the sea." And the upshot of this problem was for him to was for people of color, black people and others, to fight back against racism, as Du Bois predicted they would. It was the problem of the color line being acted out in 20th century in a 20th century world. And when you think about it, in 1945, as late as 1945, over 50% of the world's population was subordinated by force to Western imperial countries, white over black, broadly defined, in a very important way. So the liberation, I was writing an article the other day trying to think how to think about this. I mean, a lot of things happened in the 20th century. Hitler, many world wars, etc., etc. There's no more dramatic fact than the fact that over 50% of the world's population fought back against oppression and became liberated. Very important, not least in Africa, of course. But so, in fact, that struggle was won. But then I go on. And won? Well, not quite. There was rather more to Western global power than racism, however important that dimension was in its own right. There was also the aforementioned fact that Western imperialism was motivated in its rise to global prominence not only by white arrogance, Christian hubris, and profound cultural insensitivity. No, it also had at its core firm economic motives spawned by a capitalist socio-economic system that first found its feet in Western Europe and then slowly but surely reached out its multiple tentacles to embrace the world. It was on this stage, of course, that the epic drama of successful anti-colonialism was also to play itself out. Yet it is the case that even as the firmly racist structures exemplified by direct colonial domination were peeled back, much of the economic basis of the West's predominance was still in place at the end of the decolonization process, framing a system that many were soon to term neo-colonialism. Now, what I do in the rest of this section, because really my paper is divided into three sections, I'm talking about what I see to be the overall pattern of the global development, but also in the second section I'll look at Cabral and Fanon specifically. And then I look at Southern Africa within the framework of those two preceding sections in the latter part of the paper. But here we have a situation in which there is a decolonization taking place, and I then go on in this section to spell that out. What it looked like to move from colonialism into a world in which American hegemony was certainly established. This was the era of the American Empire, but it meant the resubordination of virtually all of the countries, not all, but most of the countries who were formerly colonized, into neo-colonies. Now, I think the world has changed again. I've had this debate with my colleagues Sam Gindin and Leo Penich. I no longer think the word American Empire is what captures what exists. I think now we have a much more diverse and multiplex system of global oppression and control. There are now players from China in particular, Japan, India, Brazil. If you're in Mozambique, as Judith will know, I mean, one of the main voices of imperialism is Brazilian imperialism. This is a multilateral kind of system. What I have come to call it, and I think it does actually summarize what it means, is that we now face an empire of capital that has replaced the empire of the U.S., or at least added to it in ways that make for a change. It's a qualitative change towards a more multi-centered, but still imperial domination of most of the rest of the globe, particularly in the global south, by a capital. And I think what has happened, I've used this term too, I think what this means is that this empire of capital has now recolonized the rest of the world. It's no longer the colonialization of formal colonialism, the earliest stage. It's no longer neocolonialism, the American stage. I call it a recolonization by the empire of capital. So I spell that argument out at most in this first section, and arrive at the suggestion at the end that what we have to then think about for most global south countries, but particularly for Africa, is their dependent state vis-a-vis this empire of capital. They are dependencies. The term dependency captures the reality very, very succinctly. So I think that's the broad framework in which I would set a discussion that we want to have. There is a decolonization, a recolonization has taken place by the empire of capital, but fully players in this are the local elites that become active players in support of the system. In effect, they're not just pawns being moved about by global capital, they are themselves active partners with global capital in the way in which the system functions. And that's what you have to be a bit careful about, thinking of it as primarily race versus, there's a racial dimension to this, of course. It's still to some extent a white system, but it isn't really. I mean, the Chinese and the Indians, etc., those people in their society who are part of this reigning world of capital. It's a system that's a bit more complicated than all of that. Now, this system is, of course, the system of colonialism and of false decolonization, are precisely the system that Fanon was writing about. He doesn't get to the recolonization stage because, of course, he died in the 1960s, before capital had begun to diversify into different kinds of dimensions in the way that recolonization allows us to think. But he did say that the imperial powers, the French included, which he was particularly interested in, were actually, as people became aware that colonialism was not an acceptable system, the colonial powers themselves became active players in facilitating decolonization. And he says, at one point, he says, quick, let's decolonize. He sort of makes up a quote from the French. He's saying that they were for quick decolonization because then they could control it in some economic way, which of course happened. Now, I think he does blur the lines a little bit, although he makes some very strong statements about the way the United States is coming on board as the center of this new system. He does blur a little bit the change from formal colonialism via, say, French and British continuing colonialism to American dominance and hegemony. Because we have a new world that is primarily America-centered, although there are other players as well, subordinate players within that system, which are the old colonial powers still acting out their colonial role. But there is a movement here. What Fanon doesn't talk about, of course, is the further movement towards recolonization by a more multi-centric capitalist system that begins to dominate. But still, most of those centers, and we can return to this, are outside Africa and still dominant over Africa in the name of capital, not strictly in the case of American Empire or British Empire, but in the name of capital. They control the game. And they have some international organizations like the World Bank and the IMF, but those themselves are to a degree under American control. Yes and no. The system is more complicated than that. But that's the reality of the system, and this is the kind of context in the first instance in this shift from colonialism to neocolonialism that Cabral was talking about. The colonial powers, but even more the United States, in a way began to think nationalism is a good thing. We can work with these nationalists. We can absorb them into our system. They can become our men on the spot, and sometimes women, but not very often. They can become our men on the spot for reproducing imperialism vis-a-vis their local populations, which is indeed what happened. And it's still happening, although now I think it's happening more under the aegis of a multipolar capitalism than under one particular capitalist power, which is true during the epoch of the more unalloyed American Empire. And it's in this context as well that you get this picture from Fanon that most of the leaders of Africa have been on offer and have been bought, sold, and paid for by dominant imperialism, the imperialism of neocolonialism. Cabral says that, yes, well, no, not necessarily. these leaders could, quote, commit class suicide. Maybe there is some reason to think that they're vulnerable to being co-opted by capitalism, but they could, in fact, find themselves part of a movement that is more popularly driven from below. And he spelled that out, and of course it didn't really happen as Cabral hoped it would. In fact, most of the leaders in Southern Africa, as we will now see, became themselves the intermediaries of global capitalism, particularly global capitalism, not just American or British capitalism. So putting it very quickly, because my time is running out, let me just say briefly about Southern Africa, and this I spell out at more length in the paper, but I will give it to you briefly. Many of us who were involved in the anti-apartheid movement, the liberation support movement, thought that the fact there had to be a struggle for independence in Southern Africa would make a difference. That you'd mobilize people, you'd have to mobilize people, even those of us who were somewhat suspicious, say, of the ANC and its kind of Marxist-Leninist formation, or Stalinist formation, really, said, look, there are workers and peasants in South Africa. If they get moving, they'll hold the ANC's feet to the fire and make them follow through on the revolutionary process. Well, in fact, it didn't happen quite like that. In virtually every one of the Southern African countries, and some fought for a period to retain a progressive stance, Mozambique in particular, which Judith will talk about, did have a revolutionary practice for a brief period of time. But slowly but surely, the Fanonist pull, if you want to call it that, towards assimilation into this larger system, albeit, as I say, a system increasingly multiform in terms of the countries from outside who are involved in it, but the same system hits Africa, controlled by the imperatives of capital rather than the imperatives of their own needs and aspirations. Now, this leads to a final question that is a very complicated one. How can that system be resisted? Now, there are two possible hypotheses as to how this can be resisted. One is that these countries may, some will even argue are, becoming countries that can have their own capitalist revolutions. After all, this is in a much more multipolar capitalist world. Bourgeoisies can come forth that can begin to entrepreneurially lead their countries. My friend Jesse, we've talked about this in his thesis on Angola, seems to see in his petro-capitalism of Angola the wherewithal by which a class might emerge that could become a capitalist transforming agent for Angola. Joe Hanlon, I've had constant debates with him, says to some degree the same about Mozambique. We can expect a Mozambican surge behind Armando Guebuza, South Africa's Mozambique's president, but also its richest capitalist, a surge that could actually transform Mozambique. Moletsi Mbeki, the brother of Thabo Mbeki, has said, this is what we should be doing in South Africa. He says, under my brother, they had a kind of black economic empowerment, which was just contracts and rentier openings for Africans in South Africa. We could really have a national capitalism and a capitalist revolution. And others have argued the same point. It's really Bill Warren's argument, if you may recall, which is imperialism as the vanguard of capitalism. Imperialism will ultimately create capitalist successors. Now, his system, of course, was still left. He said they're going to have a capitalist revolution thanks to imperialism, and a working class will be created who will then, and only then, lead these countries towards socialism, which may be a more decent and humane society. Now, the final question then is, can we imagine alternatively, if in fact dependency doesn't work, if in fact capitalism of a more creative and vibrant kind isn't very likely either, can we imagine a socialism that would do so, where the people are democratically in control of their government and in control of their economy, and it begins to follow out on a socialist logic that is more humane, but also more developmental? Question mark. It ain't happened yet. So one can't be too smug and say it must be socialist, but the others don't work either. So we have to think that perhaps there is the wherewithal there. And in fact, if you look around the Southern Africa, you begin to see, particularly in South Africa, the seeds of a possible alternative. There's a pretty universal feeling that the ANC, as an agent of transformation of South Africa, racially or in terms of class, has failed. is still legitimate as those who won independence. That was not a small accomplishment. They got rid of Whitey in the most obvious way, and that's not a bad thing, particularly given the way the South African state operated. But they haven't even begun to transform South Africa socioeconomically. In fact, the gap between race and races in South Africa has narrowed, in part because some blacks have become quite wealthy indeed, thank you very much, but the gap between rich and poor is widening. And in South Africa you also have not yet a revolt against the ANC that turns out to change things in terms of elections, but you have a situation in which South Africa has the highest rate of demonstration and activity against the established structures of any country in the world. So there is a tension here in this system. It hasn't yet taken the shape of putting forward a socialist alternative in South Africa. People are talking about it. What it will look like, we don't know. But the game's afoot in Southern Africa, particularly in South Africa, that could see some dramatic transformations. I remember years ago, Norman Mailer wrote a book about the March on Washington against the Vietnam War, and he said, we may yet win. The others are so stupid. And then he adds, God help us when we do. So I don't think socialism is going to be easy either to achieve or to build in this world that on the whole is against it still, but it's not. But global capitalism isn't quite working either. It's working in terms of reinforcing itself in power terms. It's vulnerable to critique, and I would think in the long run it's vulnerable to action, our action. Thank you.
It's like 5 minutes if you watch.
Oh, by the way, I wanted to know.
Okay.
Did I really come in on that? You scared me.
Okay, next up is Judith Marshall. She is a researcher and educator based at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Prior to this, she worked with the Steelworkers Humanity Fund, which carries out solidarity work amongst workers and communities all over the world, including in parts of Africa. Amongst other work, she is the author of Literacy, Power and Democracy in Mozambique, the Governance of Learning from Colonization to the Present.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you to the organizers of this event. I think the last time that I spoke at York was an event in honor of John's retirement, and a group of scholar activists were invited to come for that occasion.
They can't get rid of me, Judith.
Pardon me?
They can't get rid of me.
I was just going to say, and he's still here. But since that time, I have been more immersed in the activist side of that, working with the Steelworkers Humanity Fund, which has a number of collaborations with organizations in other parts of the world. But the intense ones recently for me have certainly been in Mozambique, and working with particularly trade unions, but also community activists in these mining areas, because there is a big mining boom going on in Mozambique, led by the biggest of the big, Vale, the new mega player from Brazil, and Rio Tinto, etc. I retired in July and will keep a hand in that work in Mozambique, but the retirement has allowed me to do some writing about these areas that I've been involved in, and I did a paper for a conference in September that the Institute for Social and Economic Studies in Maputo sponsored, and that gave me an opportunity to do a paper on that I entitled Working for the Worst Company in the World, since we had managed last year at this time to have Vale win the dubious honor in Davos of being named the worst company in the world. This paper was one where it was possible to then look at working for this company with some sampling of voices from workers in Mozambique, in Brazil, and in Canada, where of course Vale has become a major player after it purchased Inco here. So this event today has given me the opportunity to sort of move out of all of that data from workers and just think a little bit more about the framing of it, which was one of the things that was good for me to be able to do when I worked on that earlier paper, just to step back for a moment and try to understand the forces that were and are at play in that very dramatic mining boom that's taking place in Mozambique. And I will look at that in the paper, trying to characterize the major social actors involved in it, from the big mining companies themselves to what role the Mozambique government is playing, and I can assure you it's not committing suicide as a class, and the role of workers and the trade union organizations, some of the things that are happening in the communities, and some of the things that are happening amongst scholars. So I want to look at each of those players and how it's responding. But I must say, when I started thinking my way back into this, that it, of course, took me back to my own experiences of Africa that started in 1967 when I went to Ghana to work as a volunteer in a project related to Volta River Project. This was post-Nkrumah Ghana. He had been ousted in a coup, I think 2 years before I arrived. There were 2 more coups during the time that I was there, but coups notwithstanding, the integrity of Volta River Project, if you could call it integrity, was maintained in terms of this as the sort of flagship project for the industrialization of Ghana. So this was the vision of post-independence Ghana, a nation state taking its place amidst that discourse of development that prevailed in that era, and damming the mighty Volta River, using Ghana's bauxite, creating an integrated aluminum industry, the first major project towards Ghana's industrialization. This was the dream that had come from the Nkrumah era and was continued with his successors. There were teams from Ontario Hydro back and forth offering the technical assistance even in that era. Strangely enough, none of that dream played itself out, which for me points to one of the continuities of what we see today, because in fact it was bauxite from Jamaica that was used in that project, and in the end the big winners in the project were the new imperialist power emerging post Second World War, the Americans. And so Kaiser and Reynolds, 2 major aluminum companies, built a smelter downstream in the port city, the newly created port city of Tema, and they were boasting very soon that they were able to put aluminum onto world markets at the cheapest price of any aluminum production taking place anywhere. And so for me, some of the continuities in terms of I mean, that was way back, and yet contemporary Mozambique and some of that same set of players in the game, major transnational companies, major numbers of people resettled in Ghana. 80,000 people were resettled around the lake that formed at that time the largest man-made lake in the world. And the particular job I was doing in this volunteer capacity through Ghana Christian Council was in these new resettlement towns. But then the easy ability to treat fairly lightly and tread fairly heavily on the lives of 80,000 rural producers in the name of this greater good, this vision of a major industrial project, and a whole notion of development that had to do with these newly created nation states taking on a model of development that was a kind of catch-up with Western development and had many of the same characteristics. So a notion of development that had to do with urbanization, proletarianization, modernization, all of these things caught up in the package. And so as I say, coming into the preparation for this talk, which I've entitled Mining Megaprojects in Mozambique, National Development or a New Imperialism of Capital, it really made me think about the continuities and feeling as if I'm sort of going over the same bumps again in terms of major resettlements in Mozambique, a similar thing in terms of of treading very heavily on rural producers all around who are being displaced because of the open pits that are being constructed for these major coal projects in northern Mozambique. I guess one of the sources that I've drawn on a lot in the paper is someone who I really stumbled on as I went back to being the scholar again, and this name I expect is well known to many of you, but in a footnote of Anna Zalek, who some of you may know here from Surlac, she made reference to James Ferguson, and I found that some of the very provocative essays that he has done looking at these very questions that have been engaged with in this work in Mozambique, in terms of notions of development, in terms of the role of mining companies at this juncture of history, and all of this particularly in Africa. And I think one of the things that he says that's very interesting, and particularly this afternoon with these comments we've been making, or these quotes we've been talking of from Cabral, national liberation struggles as an imperialist initiative. I think this is another way of saying what Ferguson did when he talks about at the end of empire, a story about the emergence of new nations by processes of modernization or development provided a new grid for interpreting and explaining the world's inequalities. As the backwards nations, in quotes, advanced in this optic, a modern form of life encompassing a whole package of elements, including such things as industrial economy, scientific technology, liberal democratic politics, nuclear families, and secular worldviews, would become universalized, and in the process, poor countries would overcome their poverty, share in the prosperity of the developed world, and take their place as equals in a worldwide family of nations. I mean, Ferguson argues that with all that has happened from the 50s to today, that discourse about development is strangely held on to, really in the face of what we see happening. So people scratching their heads about continuing poverty or pontificating about failed states, but somehow this expectation that it was supposed to have been different, and there was some inexorable process through which these nation states, newly independent, were going to embark on a path towards development, and development measured in all of the ways you said. And I think this is what we find today, that this discourse, which is not only a way to camouflage the rape and pillage that we spoke of more openly during the colonial era, but which is not very different at all from the kind of rape and pillage that we see today. To cloak that and justify some of the brutal impacts of some of these projects, particularly on rural people. We do that in the name of this inexorable path towards development. And I suppose, I mean, he goes on to argue that even those who are the colonized themselves, or the ex-colonized, take a certain amount of comfort from this discourse, some notion that this is a path that is, however quickly or slowly, moving them forward, that their fate is not always to be at the bottom, it's just the not yet side of it. I found this quite fascinating, and as a way of thinking about how that language is still trumped out in the face of what really is not moving in those directions at all. So all of that set me back to thinking about Mozambique at the time of its own independence, and how much the Mozambique Liberation Front itself was asking a different kind of question, or really had a different imaginary, a different conceptualization of where their liberation struggle was taking them. Certainly they moved in some of the same circles, some of the same events that Cabral was speaking of, some of the students in Portugal, and a certain left discourse during study days there, some more himself training in Algeria, so contact with debates and the realities of people's war. So certainly that theme that we've already talked about in terms of a non-negotiated process of independence. In the case of Portugal, colonial power digging in its heels and staying, and therefore the need for a people's war, and what that meant in terms of a petty bourgeois grouping that perhaps was the class source of the nationalist movement, but having to take their own peasant producers seriously, because to gain inroads from Zambia and Tanzania into the north of Mozambique, if they didn't find a way to mobilize and gain credibility, they would be exposed to the Portuguese army very quickly. And so that need to carry out a war in a different way. I think one of the most insightful things that I've come across about this, maybe apart from talking with John, because John who I think I remember he told me that he was AKA the professor and was called at many and sundry moments to just chit-chat about political questions with Samora and with other Frelimo leaders. So I mean, he needs some, and he's someone who can talk about what it all looked like in their heads at this time.
You can't blame me.
But another very important source is an article that was written in a book of tributes to Samora by José Luis Cabasso, who had been had worked clandestinely for Frelimo as a student, a white Mozambican originally from Portugal, and he'd worked clandestinely and then held several ministerial posts after independence. And it's an extremely interesting article he does that is called "The New Man: Brief History of a Project," and he talks about the concept, the way the Samora and the Frelimo leaders at that time understood the liberation process. Has funny stories to tell, having them all arrive in Dar es Salaam to launch the armed struggle, all of them coming out of military training in different countries and with some degree of military ranking in hand. They got to Dar es Salaam and they seemed to be in danger of quickly forgetting all their revolutionary credentials and military discipline, and so Frelimo asking to have a base in rural Tanzania, and so the Congo camp being set up. And the first question when they all arrived in this new camp was, who's going to cook for us? And all these ranking officers, this was immediately a problem. Of course, Samora is the one who became the first cook, but these very fundamental lessons about revolution as serving the people, or revolution as a leadership that is served by those below it. I think that process during those years of the armed struggle was, as they often said, the real school that formed them as a movement. And I guess it wasn't entirely in jest that when the coup happened, there were some laments that it had happened too quickly and that they were learning so much from what they were having to do as they began to construct a new life for themselves in the liberated areas. I think when I and others arrived there right after independence, some of that conceptualization of leadership as serving the people, a revolutionary process that was rooted in its own people, where a sort of basic needs agenda for its own people was the primary path ahead that we lived at. I mean, I'm really glad I was there in those years, because looking back on it now, I mean, if anybody told me about it, I wouldn't believe it could have happened, because it seems so remote from what today looks like. But truly, it was an exciting, and it was a real privilege to have lived there during those years. It was, like Samora himself had trained as a nurse, health, huge priority, winning prizes from the World Health Organization for the excellence of the primary health care programs. Literacy, 92% of the population illiterate in independence, but the first watchword of the transitional year was do literacy. If you know how to read, teach others. And so a kind of spontaneous literacy program all over the country, and that fairly quickly morphed into the national literacy crusades that I and others were involved in those early years. Housing, nationalization of rentable property, people who'd lived in a city for years but never had the right to construct a house, suddenly getting housing. So some of those things happened. interesting things also in terms of popular mobilization, the dynamizing groups that form. So every school, every workplace, every community, every church, not church, we'll leave that one aside, but at every level through the society, groupings of people, transmission back and forth of concerns from the base and directives coming from Frelimo. An interesting moment with that happening in terms of a level of popular participation. Over time, lots of problems with all of that. Choice to declare itself a Marxist-Leninist party, a moment of mass organizations, the women's organization, the workers' organization, the youth organization. I mean, some of that fluidity of the process definitely hardened into then these organizations as transmission belts, more and more directives from above. Were there any visions of an alternative kind of economic development? I think not. I mean, it was the idea of a Western model and Western consumption goods as the marks of development. Interesting moment when Zamora was doing surprise visits on a kind of organizational initiative to prompt more production, and went to the port in Beira where he found a scene of much confusion and lack of knowledge of where this was, that was, nothing moving in and out of the port as it should have. And the port workers saying, but Mr. President, if you went to Dar es Salaam, I mean, the confusion there is even greater. And Zamora apparently was said, well, actually, Hamburg was the place I had in mind as the reference point. So maybe a little of Zamora's arrogance and pretentiousness, but a project that was definitely one of hard work and an idea that development could be, in fact, something realized. How much the weaknesses within the process itself are to be blamed, how much the low-intensity war that South Africa mounted against Mozambique, that was an economic boycott, a persistent disinformation campaign, the supplying of Renamo and the kinds of terrorist attacks that, and the way that all of the new gains after independence became the focal point for these attacks. It's hard, all of that was happening, and certainly those gains of the first years were very much in jeopardy because of those. So, as Cabasso said in his description of what was going on, it was a time of erosion of some of the gains. He recounts a moment after Zimbabwe's independence in 1980 when Frelimo militants came and were saying, well, in Zimbabwe, I mean, they're revolutionaries and it's not a problem for them to own property and to hire people to work on their property. And so the door's opening a bit, and someone else in Frelimo at the time saying, well, this is a slippery slope. You can hire 2 people today, but next year it will be 4, and the year after that. And if you look at Business, the name given to Gabuza today, you see where it can go, and it's a pretty scary picture. So Zamora's dreams evaporating, and the work that they'd done to create the new Mozambican, a Mozambican characterized by these characteristics of service to others, of solidarity, all of the steps towards equality, all of that really severely eroded, and not even a subject of discussion after Zamora's death because of the actions of the South African military. So in the paper then, and of course this nostalgia has taken me down too many roads in the past and not enough to contemporary, but let me just very quickly try to sketch out what we're looking at today. So in terms of these mining companies, I think the really interesting thing about them in terms of our discussion today is that they are so characteristic of the new trend in mining. So mining today has nothing to do with needing a stable state and democratic underpinnings. Mining companies love enclaves. Mining companies are most happy when they can be in a very remote area and be entirely self-sufficient, up to and including bringing in their own security forces. The less that there is observation of the huge impact that a mine makes, the less there are people clamoring about what is happening to local people as they're being moved away, the better. And so we've got a particular moment in the history of mining. In the paper, I dwell on that at some length out of some discussions at a recent mining conference that our own union had. But that characteristic of mining as having to do not with being linked into a project of national economic development, but of being simply a transnational operation parachuted in an enclave. The choices of technology that make it hire fewer people rather than more, highly skilled rather than less skilled, happiest when numbers of workers can be employed from outside on a regular basis. That's the kind of mining project. It's not one that really creates links with the communities, becomes a focal point for a larger path of economic development. And the interesting thing in Mozambique is that really, like the best voices challenging it, some of the researchers who are doing good work and questioning whether big mining projects actually create development or alleviate poverty. I mean, their alternative is still a vision that I think is not cognizant of the role of mining companies today and what they do. That the nation state is not their milieu. Their milieu is wherever there's ore, and they will do. I mean, the oil in Angola is perhaps perfect for them. Neither the resource itself nor the wealth it creates even touches the African soil. It's just an offshore enclave, and the onshore ones are not much different. So that's the mining company. In terms of the workers who are involved in it, the paper goes at some length to trace out the history of unions in Mozambique. And one of the saddest quotes in it was one that I felt I should put in, but it's from a Mozambican in one of the few articles done about labor in Mozambique. But he says that, kind of regretfully, that really the difference for workers between the fascist project of Portugal and the socialist project of Frelimo was not hugely different. In each, they had very different objectives, but for the worker, it was a very heavy presence of the state on top of the trade union movement, a national project that was driving the economy, and the role of the worker was to be disciplined and produce in that national project. There was no role of a union in defending individual worker rights or in really challenging the owners of capital in terms of a more dignified set of working conditions. And so there's and I certainly can speak to how difficult it is to now, as these young workers, I mean, it's a whole different generation of people. So these young workers who get jobs in the mines are people who speak English and Portuguese, spend their nights on the internet and on Skype, have high technical degrees. It's a whole different Mozambique than the one that I lived in when I was there after independence, clearly. But as they begin to flex a little bit of muscle in terms of really trying to wrestle some kind of respect and dignity out of these big mining companies, they discover that they have to face not only the power of the mining companies, not only the power of the state, because the Mozambique government, when Vale, for example, was introduced to them coming in on Lula's arm, the first thing they did was to appoint the president of Vale as one of the members of Gabuza's special committee advising him on global investments. So these young workers have to deal with the company, they have to deal with the state, and they have to deal with a trade union movement that is all for labor peace and not very much for labor justice. And so they're finding that they're bumping their heads against their own union as well. So there's much more that I would love to have had time to say, but didn't. But hopefully in the discussion a little bit more can come up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Judith. Our final speaker today, at least for this panel, is Franco Barchiesi. He's an associate professor in the Department of African American and African Studies at Ohio State University. His latest book, Perils Liberation, Workers, the State, and Contested Social Citizenship in Post-Colonial South Africa, was the winner of the 2012 CLR James Award of the Working Class Studies Association. He's also co-edited a collection of essays titled Rethinking the Labor Movement in the New South Africa.
Thank you. Yeah, well, if my paper has a connection, I think it is very loose, in fact, with the thought and praxis of Amilcar Cabral, that connection is in the kind of emphasis that I'm also trying to put on on African social and cultural practices, what many scholars refer to as subjectivity, and how the complexity of those subjectivities problematize and question various attempts to colonial, post-colonial, neoliberal origins to categorize socio-political order in Africa. And I do that by focusing specifically on the question of labor, the position of labor and employment, and related discourses. And when it comes to those issues, the concept of precarity has lately come to shape the debates on relations between employment changes and the socio-political order. Precarity encompasses, in fact, both a sense of the deep-seated constitutive insecurity of work in a context of global economic liberalization and the translation of such insecurity into social movement projects, which is very much stock in trade for the so-called autonomist Marxism, for example, but also more mainstream scholars like Guy Stanley. Since the turn of the current century, mobilizations of precarious workers have expanded across Western capitalist countries, targeting the neoliberal emphasis on individual economic activities in realities where jobs are in fact increasingly created under insecure, oppressive and unrewarding conditions. Precarity therefore defines the politicization of precarious employment, the attempt to transcend it as a mere sociological issue or policy problem, and rather articulate it as a challenge for social relations affected by a dilemma that André Gorth well captured, and I quote here: "Never has the irreplaceable, indispensable function of labor as the source of social ties, social cohesion, integration, socialization, personalization, personal identity, and meaning been invoked so obsessively as it has since the day it became unable any longer to fulfill any of those functions." Some scholars of precarity like Nielsen and Rossiter observe, furthermore, that the use of precarity to designate a modality of social movement politics is specifically pronounced in those countries, as in Southern Europe, where unprotected and unguaranteed labor is perceived as a departure from historical norms, where work is supposedly stabilized by welfarist arrangements or corporatist compacts. The erosion of such institutional frameworks leads to the demand by younger generations of workers for types of livelihoods, for example, universal basic income, that are decommodified or accessible regardless to individual occupational or labor market status, whether you have a job or not, in other words. As an apparent paradox, such political usages of the concept of precarity, they continue, Nielsen and Rossiter, tend to fade in realities like English-speaking liberal capitalism, where the market's determination of workers' conditions is more deeply entrenched. In other words, precarity as a concept that refers not only to the labor market but to social and political conflicts targets the imagination of capitalist modernity at two critical junctures. First, precarity highlights the hollowness of governmental promises, if not the mendacity of governmental promises of citizenship as predicated on employment and economic participation. Second, the concept of precarity departs from an entrenched 20th century left discourse according to which the fulfillment of that promise of work with citizenship and dignity was predicated upon the working class as a collective organized identity and a subject of popular sovereignty. And that's what my book is about. Once the definition of precarity as a concept has come to rest on two constitutive features, structural employment insecurity and its politicization as a challenge to the disciplining practices of the state, capital and left forces alike, it also starts revealing features that students of African labor should find familiar. Throughout the continents, the African continent's colonial as well as post-colonial predicament, in fact, precarious workers has constituted not a departure from the assumed normality of waged employment, but rather a widespread, albeit highly diversified and contextually specific material reality, and a field for collective choices and individual life strategies to counter, alleviate, or negotiate capitalist labor market discipline. Some of these themes have resonate with what the previous speakers was talking about. On the other hand, the problematic position of commodity producing work in Africa has been the result not only, in Fanonian terms, of its limited extent or how wage workers are close to the failed nationalist post-colonial state and the congenital vulnerability of trade union organizations despite the episodic radicalism of some of their grassroots mobilizations. A major interest of labor studies in colonial societies resides precisely, in fact, in the ways in which wage labor discursively underpinned governmental projects, which also decisively overshadowed the post-colonial institutionality of African nation states, of independent African states. The imperative of working for wages is in particular central to the complex dynamics of naming, determining, and structuring the natives' difference, which provided a defining feature of white settlers' worldwide expansion, as Catherine Hall has quite powerfully documented, or the colonial state itself, as George Steinmetz has also insightfully shown, as well as late colonial social reforms and post-colonial developmental interventions by international organizations and NGOs. Even if coercion eventually prevailed as a mode for commodity production among non-white peoples that resisted market relations, the gospel of spreading free labor, as it used to be called back then, a couple of centuries ago, played a decisive role in legitimizing colonialism as an extension of anti-slavery and emancipationist movement, and this is core element in this whole paper, I would say. I mean, the assumption that there is a fundamental continuity between slave emancipation and African colonialism, a continuity that has been, again, quite well documented, again, by Catherine Hall, Robin Blackburn recently, Uday Singh Mehta, and so on and so forth. Regardless of how oppressively colonized people materially experienced work, the dignity of labor, to evoke another time-honored slogan, acted as a powerful concept through which whiteness defined itself in relation to subjugated others that could be thought not only as mysterious, unknowable, unreliable, and threatening, but also as potential instantiations of the homo economicus preached by political economy, which assumed the virtuous attributes of ambition, acquisitiveness, and personal responsibility as the actor and subject of ascendant liberal governance. The pretenses and self-image of white Western modernity as a self-conscious, world-encompassing totality cannot be understood without foregrounding how economic activity and the repertoire of political economy provided simultaneously a universal horizon towards which human conduct ought to be orientated, and a hierarchical justification for the unequal treatment of colonized others deemed on this very basis as incompletely human. The hierarchies of work also determine the hierarchical ordering of the household and women's precarious position in social reproduction. Patriarchal authority centered on monetary remuneration and underwritten by Western family policies and legal regimes cemented, in fact, African masculinity and colonial governance in the joint effort of disciplining rebellious youth and wayward, quote-unquote, women, as domesticity became another state-sanctioned imaginary site of order. Deepesh Chakrabarty and Fred Cooper have commented upon how, in colonial contexts, the colonized working class was the product not just of social relations, but also of imaginative and discursive practices, discursive forces that made, in complex, prolonged, asynchronous, place-specific trajectories, native workers the desired subjectivity, as Chakrabarty puts it, of their own rulers, as well as local elites and even nationalist leaders. The object of that governmental desire, or as Cooper puts it, the African working class as a predictable and productive collectivity. That is what both nationalist rulers and post-colonial rulers, both colonial and post-colonial rulers wanted to achieve. The working class as a predictable and productive collectivity was predicated upon the idea that the dignity of labor could provide for the native, quote-unquote, a path of self-improvement which combined the otherwise idiosyncratic and conflicting elements of the capitalist work ethic as a normative universal with the discriminatory treatment and conditions of white and black workers, urban and rural colonized laborers, and formal, usually male, and informal, quite often female segments of the quote-unquote native proletariat. It was a fantasy of rule consisting in the Europeans' aim of dictating to Africans a virtuous path to their own modernization that could also function to justify on moral as well as pseudo-scientific basis the material disparities resulting from the alleged difference of subjective positions along that very linear path. In other words, the discipline of labor was presented as a universal, but a universal to which people acceded to by stages, and depending on those stages, populations, even ethnic groups, rural and urban people, were categorized in hierarchical terms. The use of wage labor as a device for colonialism to don the mantle of socio-economic progress was not even a feature of the reforms in the late colonialism, as much historiography has emphasized. In settler, especially mining-based colonies, it accompanied the early governmental discovery, for example in the Holloway Commission report in South Africa in 1932, or the Davis Inquiry into Zambian mine workers in 1933, the discovery that there are permanently urbanized Africans, not merely and these permanently urbanized Africans are not merely a transient feature. They are not just villagers in the city, but they are an inevitable element that presented the colonial state with challenges as well as opportunities. To the alarm at the possibility of African workers' organization and action, European rulers responded by placing waged work and consumerism, or the promotion of artificial want, to mention another expression that was very popular in the 19th century, at the core of a vision of African uplift under European supervision, which was no longer moral in nature, the mission civilisatrice, but rather was now articulated as a new discourse of socio-economic interdependence, although within the boundaries of unquestionable racial identities. Self-improvement through waged employment was at the core of complex dynamics of opposition and mutual recognition through which the agenda of African anti-colonial nationalism was gradually channeled towards Western capitalist or state socialist notions of productivism and away from ordinary practices of work avoidance and resistance to proletarianization that were very much more part of the everyday life of many proletarianized populations. In the case of South Africa, it was indeed the leadership of the nascent African National Congress that already in the 1920s, it was not the colonial state, it was the leadership of the ANC that already in the 1920s took the initiative in conceptualizing wage labor as a condition of claims and political visibility while deprecating and demonizing the disruptiveness of quote-unquote work-shy African township youths or underachieving tribal natives. I talk about that in a paper that I recently published in a book on 100 years of the ANC. I mean, but that is very much, I mean, the African nationalism played an important role in that kind of development along those Western categories. To go back, in fact, to one of the comments earlier on. By casting African opposition to capitalist work discipline as pathological, atavistic, and anti-political, and by accepting wage labor as a universal conduit to virtue despite the exploitation, subjugation, and violence through which black workers had to endure it, anti-colonial nationalism decisively contributed to the precariousness not only of wage earning itself, but of all attempts of reclaiming from below a dignity of life that defied the dignity of labor peddled by white rulers. Yet African labor historians have constantly emphasized how African workers have not experienced precarious works predominantly as a condition of anomie, invisibility, and disempowerment, but articulated it with life strategies and insurgent subjectivities. Well, I would probably say African labor historians and historians of African labor, because in fact Frederick Cooper's classic study of dock workers in Mombasa, but at this point I think something similar can be said about dock workers in Beira maybe. Cooper, when studying dock workers in Mombasa, identifies as a thorny problem in colonial governance the need to control the physical movement of workers who chose casual occupations, who chose to be in and out of jobs, articulating waged work with multiple networks of livelihood and non-capitalist subsistence as ways to escape or alleviate the impact of capitalist workplace discipline and production rhythms. It was a strategy of struggle, in other words, not just a condition of disempowerment as the current debates on precarious work represented. Far from embracing proletarianization, as recommended by anti-capitalist left and labor organizations as a necessary step towards working class solidarity and progressive change, a linear view of historical time that mirrored the colonizer's own while opposing it, African commodity producers resisted becoming a working class, or translated that condition in forms that departed from class or workplace-centered identities. Deprecating of dismissing the wage relation, not endorsing it, provided outlets for agency. And here, literally, the examples are innumerable by now. As Congolese mine workers saw the wage as barren wealth, a study by John Higginson. For Tswana migrants in South Africa, there was this antagonism, in fact, between Tiro and Mereko, doing and working, whereby working Mereko, which came, by the way, from the Afrikaans work, I mean, European word, was basically seen as antithetical to any notion of meaningful doing. That it was being studied by many, I mean, Hoyt Alderson, to mention just one. Rumors spread in East Africa that the technologies of the capitalist workplace disguised vampires feeding on living communities. Louise White talked about that. Rural income networks allowed South African mine workers to desert their jobs and seek unauthorized self-employment rather than choosing to organize as a class. Patrick Harris has written abundantly about that. The transition from European rule to independent African nation states took place under normative assumptions, juridical systems, political elites, and economic paradigms inherited from the colonial past. The condition that Achille Mbembe defines as the post-colony maintained the tension between the allegedly timeless, self-evident, fully human imperatives to economic activity and market participation, and a set of coercive practices and institutional injunctions, development, nation building, aimed at putting to work Africans otherwise deemed as unreliable and ultimately incapable on their own of, to quote from Mbembe again, of uttering the universal. The need of using coercive means to bring to life what the hegemonic liberal rationality deems to be quasi-natural market laws was also a reminder that old colonial practices survived behind the alleged technocratic neutrality of international organizations and global NGOs, which were now mediating the incorporation of African elites in the post-war and post-colonial world economic system. Their discursive repertoire reproduced the precariousness of African labor within economies depending on the export of primary commodities, in which the fate of local producers seemed to be either that of small contingents of wage earners dependent on the sanction and protection of the nationalist state when not employed by the state itself, or, as Andrew Burton shows in the case of Dar es Salaam, as intermittent workers recalcitrant to full-time work and thus deemed to be categorized as dangerous classes by development experts and African leaders alike. Sure enough, continuities should not be overemphasized, as the post-colony was also part of post-colonization as a condition in which African workers' appropriation of governmental normative bywords allowed them to articulate wage labor with claims for citizenship rights and equality, and that is not insignificant. The mobility and migration of formerly colonized peoples also helped them reclaim, for example, migration to Europe or to North America, helped them reclaim resources on a global scale and contest both their own identities and the West's claim of universality, as the West itself became more, in Chakrabarty's terms, provincialized. But in Africa, the validity of post-colonialism as a characterization of agency, hybridization, reinvention, and contingent assemblages of meanings and discourse, which is very much a certain kind of post-colonial vulgara presented that way today, was challenged. It was not non-existent there, but it was at least very partial, and it was challenged by the increasingly aggressive reassertion of commodity-producing work, meted out with the extraordinary brutality of arbitrary or administrative rule, disguising itself within the legalistic trappings of sovereignty, which is what Mbembe again calls the commandment. The colonial arsenal of regulations aimed at punishing vagrancy, desertion, idleness, work avoidance, desertion from labor, provided the sinews for compulsory job schemes and work programs, hence the why. I mean, as Judith said, I mean, sometimes the fascistic and the capitalistic, the fascistic and the socialist work discipline didn't taste very differently. and programs that were especially targeted at young people, for which the post-colonial promise of advancement through public education rapidly faded instead. Patrick Carmody's observation that employment creation was at the core of a post-colonial social contract seems to pertain more to the realm of official imagination and rationalization than to government's capacity for legitimate rule. Well before the advent of neoliberalism and structural adjustment, the precarity of African labor had appeared to be not just a set of sociological phenomena, the limited numbers of the waged working class, the uneven penetration of market relations, the translation of de-agrarianization into informal and unprotected employment, the fragmentation and political subordination of trade unions. But it was also a political question for post-colonial governmentality. In its Foucauldian sense, the concept of governmentality refers to power shaping at a distance, as Foucault said, the conducts and fields of actions of self-organizing subjects and civil societies. I mean, government at a distance, meaning you are governed even if you're acting in the guise of freedom and self-determination. Yet it was precisely the state's heavy investment in work and economic participation that made African governmentality hollow and ultimately incapable of managing the contradiction between promises of free labor with dignity and the actual indignities, insecurities and violations that made African productions for global markets actually possible. The solemnity of post-colonial political orders drew moral arguments from work ethics and the criminalization of laziness, but as it belied the subservience of despotic local elites to global capital, international organizations or foreign military powers, it often provoked a widespread disillusionment, translating itself into social and symbolic practices as the Carrefour de la Joie, investigated by Basile NGO in Yaoundé, Cameroon, which overtly subverted official morality while ridiculing and desecrating the imperative to work. The post-colonial vulnerability of work ultimately indicated the precarity of both socio-political orders supposedly presided over by employment and modes of capital accumulation in which surplus was extracted among persistently recalcitrant multitude. To capture the political salience of this predicament in Africa, one needs only to contrast it with the self-confidence with which during the same period, the first 3 post-war decades, European and North American states and corporations basked in the belief of having found the devices, the welfare state, productivity deals, tripartite corporatism, to turn the erstwhile threat of worker struggles into engines of stability and capitalist development. The absence of such devices in the African context facilitated the subversion and refusal of work to undermine the fragility of the continent's neocolonial arrangements. But it also paradoxically allowed neoliberalism to recode those very dynamics into the ascending template of entrepreneurialism in the age of structural adjustment. Triumphant over the collapse of nationalist progressivism and the remoteness of radical left alternatives, neoliberalism has, over the past 4 decades, recuperated in remarkably flexible and ultimately devastating ways a powerful heritage of African opposition to waged work. As economic liberalization slashed formal employment and eviscerated organized labor, the World Bank and the IMF conveyed to local elites, often socialized within their own technocratic circuits, the new notion of informality as the modern embodiment of what in the colonial times was the casual workers. But at this time the World Bank and the IMF were telling the African elites that you don't have to fear the informal work, you don't have to fear casual workers. Those are all entrepreneurs crying to come out in the crisis of stable waged employment. Rather, the entrepreneurialism and the resilience, to quote another word that is used everywhere right now, the entrepreneurialism and the resilience of the poor came to be celebrated as avenues to economic dynamism and access to resources as the state withdrew from what Mike Davis calls a planet of slums. The subjectivities that subverted the universal imperative to work with multiple, often undetected, undocumented, illegal or semi-legal modes of doing things, as Abdul Malik Simon put it, became in neoliberal discourse the protagonists of a peculiarly African way of working. Expert discourse is now ready to recognize the distinctiveness of their cultural and social forms as legitimate as long as they do not threaten the disciplinary dispositif of capitalist globalization and liberal democracy. Yet, the neoliberal recuperation of reluctance to capitalist work ethic and discipline has proven, as a project of turning Africans into governable subjects, as shaky and precarious as earlier pragmatics of government that more earnestly hinged on waged work. The combination of informalized work, declining public programs, and the growing commodification of life did not promote new economic opportunities, but rather deepened individuals' and households' dependence on labor and commodity markets as the inadequacy of monetary incomes deepened. The collapse of social safety nets, rising prices of basic necessities, and the crisis of subsistence economies reinforced the compulsion to access stable monetary income precisely when regular wage occupations dwindled. Informality discloses new avenues for accumulation, but by becoming disentangled from production and recentered around trade and circulation in uncertain legal regimes, it also accentuates the dependence of accumulation around the very social institutions, primarily family connections and political patronage, that are undermined by liberalization. On the other hand, the ways in which the imperative to accumulate is translated into practice, multifarious, unpredictable, potentially destructive, as in the proliferation of lethal economies of war, as access to resources, continue to reveal the unrealized incorporation of Africans in a modernity whose terms they are still not allowed to define. The pathologization of African social practices, as in the realm of religious or ethnic movements, in the now dominant discourse of global governance, is persistently redolent of racially inflected attempts with which whiteness manages the crisis of work among others that are deemed not yet at the level of modern human rationality. Yet those crises are often produced by complex strategies with which ordinary peoples respond to the crisis of waged work. Thus, for example, Paul Lubeck has documented how political Islam in northern Nigeria reflected the decline under structural adjustment of social support networks that had once allowed itinerant preachers to combine a self-conscious working class identity with religious practices that allowed them to avoid regular work because they could rely on on people's charity that is now basically being destroyed because there's no more money going around. As during colonial times, the language of political economy, both in its liberal entrepreneurial version and in the left's glorification of labor politics, proves thus unhelpful in charting the complexities of the social precarity of work or deciphering its political possibilities. And I'm going into concluding here. Political economy remains nonetheless, and the critique of political economy remains nonetheless central to recent attempts to conceptualize the position of African labor and labor movements in the current global crisis and tremors shaking the architecture of neoliberalism. Marcel van der Linden, in a recent essay to which I respond in an issue of International Labor and Working Class History coming out soon, Marcel van der Linden has proposed an ambitious agenda for a global labor history focused on the continuities, articulations, and connections among diverse forms of subordinated and subjugated labor, including slaves, forced labor, waged workers, indentured servants, and casual workers, on account of the fact that they have a commodity-positing status, as he says. It is a perspective that fails to account, however, this idea of a global working class because they are all because they're all creators of commodities under capitalism. It is a perspective that fails to account, however, for how the absolute dereliction and gratuitous violence, in Fanon's terms, suffered by enslaved and colonized blacks, and here I'm expanding the scope, was not only explained by the need to make them productive. It has also to do with how whiteness justified its global reach and dominant pretensions by casting its internal consistency and ethical dilemmas as human in opposition to dehumanized, enslaved, and not fully human colonized others. Whiteness as a parasitical entity on the black body, to quote from Orlando Patterson, in other words. Van der Linden's critical political economy of the global proletariat captures the historical, experiential side of black subjugation, its commodity-producing uses, and its conflicts and resistances, but does not explain blackness's position in the world, be that of a slave, a colonized laborer, or an emancipated worker. As an entity, blackness for which the central dilemma of modernity is not what does it mean to be free, but it is what does it mean to suffer. And here I am paraphrasing from, I'm quoting from Frank Wilderson, who's paraphrasing from Lacan and Fanon again. That dilemma, what does it mean to suffer, is also what irreparably disturbs when looking at the continent's colonial, neo-colonial, or neoliberal predicament, the imagined commonality of interests between African workers and those protected by the wages of whiteness, as the former are violent, African workers are violently, even lethally pulled towards the position of the slave, which anti-blackness ontologically marks. Perhaps the precariousness of African labor is then not so much a matter of labor market dynamics and employment formations, but rather invites us to an uncompromising, even disturbing stare at the ontological articulation of whiteness and blackness as essential to the world in which we live. Or maybe I should say the ontological articulation of whiteness and anti-blackness as essential to the world in which we live. In that case, precarity as a concept that pertains to social movements and labor politics only partially allows us to grasp the potentiality of black producers, whose condition is not primarily the result of being exploited as workers. If you want, this is not just pure philosophical speculation. If you read a book like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, she makes the very chilling case that in the US today, there are more black people subject to one form of coercion or another today than under slavery. One can thus wonder, 3 lines, 6. One can thus wonder whether precarity is a type of political subjectivity, a usage en vogue in the current activist parlance of the global north, and which is the starting point for this paper, can make sense of realities in which labor is, rather than a conduit of agency, a crucial arena where the violence of capital and free market liberalism produces suffering and incapacitation. To the extent such violence may well indeed disable subjectivity altogether, as the black qua-slave is a position that is objectified, hence by definition deprived of subjectivity, is incommensurable with the worker. Political projects of restoring subjectivity in the face of structural violence acquire then far-reaching, subversive, yet dramatically urgent implications for our work and commodity-obsessed global order. Thank you.